Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Diaspora Chronicles. My name is Muloongo Muchelemba, and I am the founder of Ongolo.com, which is a Pan-African website which aims to create a community by keeping Africans connected and engaged. Diaspora Chronicles is just one of two segments that I will be launching this month. The other is called Bread and Butter, which will showcase different businesses in Africa, and that starts on Wednesday next week. Diaspora Chronicles, the idea behind that is I wanted to create a platform that allows ordinary Africans like you and I to tell our stories. Now, before I invite our first speaker onto the show, I just wanted to run through some housekeeping. So the idea of Diaspora Chronicles is that it will be an interactive session which allows you to post questions or ask any questions that you like. And what I will do is I will flash the questions that will be answered onto the screen. The other thing that I've done is earlier on today, I posted on the Facebook wall of Ongolo Africa a QR code that leads you to a live poll that's been done on a website called Pigeonhole, which I absolutely love. So if you could please take your phone out, scan the QR code and use that to log on to the website and answer the 5 short questions that I have asked. So the first question I've asked is, where are you located? So we're curious to know who's actually watching the show, which country and city you're based in. So if you could please go to that, that would be amazing. So before I call Paddy onto the show, I just wanted to give you some background and context as to what triggered this conversation. So around April 12th, stories started coming out of China that people were being discriminated against. There was a disturbing picture of McDonald's where there was a poster saying no Black people are allowed in this shop and the store, and we saw pictures of people lying on the street. And so I thought, let me find somebody who's actually lived in China, can give us some context as to what's actually happening, and then help us understand what the story is about. So I'm really excited that Paddy responded to my ad on Twitter, agreeing to talk to me live on Facebook. And I'd like to now invite Paddy onto the show. So Paddy, are you with us?
Hi, Muloongo. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing good. Just settling down into my chair. Something happens when, children are aware that you have something going on. They tend to behave in a certain way, but luckily nobody's going to interrupt our conversation.
Oh, that's good to know. I really appreciate you making the time tonight, and you look fabulous. I'm loving the African ethnic. I tried to with the earrings, but you know how it goes. So I thought before we get started on the topic at hand, would be really helpful for people to get a sense of who you are. So I'm just going to put up your brief bio and hand it over to you.
So when you refer to the questions, you can just call me Paddy. I don't need to give the full name. So I'm a Zambian by nationality. I was born in Livingston. So yeah, Victoria Falls, that's us. So I'm a Vic Falls girl, meaning I was born in Livingston. And I studied economics, both for my bachelor and my master's. So for my master's, I did financial economics, and for my undergrad, I did economics and development. And I have lived in a number of countries. I've lived in Tanzania for about 7 years, where I had the privilege not only to work for donor organizations such as the European Union, but I was also sitting for some time representing donor institutions, looking at public finance management as part of a reform program there. So I lived in Tanzania for 7 years, very much vested. It's like my second home. So Mambo VP, for those of you joining us from Tanzania and from East Africa, it's a place that I hold close to my heart. And then lived in China for about 5 years and just moved to Kuala Lumpur quite recently. So we're almost clocking a year in July with our lives here in Kuala Lumpur. And I say we because I'm married and I have 2 kids, 5 and 3, and they have a special story with China. You will see there it says, and one of the languages that I speak Mandarin, but I really do hope that none of my kids walk into the room, because their Mandarin is definitely far more better than mine is, but I still do manage to navigate, carry out some basic conversation in Mandarin. So I speak Mandarin, I speak Swahili, I speak a couple of Zambian languages, yeah, from at least 3 main ones, because I'm sort of, I always call myself a multicultural Zambian, coming from different, my parents and my background is quite mixed. So that's me in a nutshell, and I'm just here to share my story on yeah, having lived in China for 5 very interesting years. Muloongo, I was just telling you that my daughter was born in China, so my kids also hold a very special place to China. My son, actually, his life was all in China, because when we arrived, he was about 4 months old.
Wow.
So, yeah, so that's my love story with China.
Okay, that's great. No, thank you for that. And you've noticed that I put on my glasses because I actually took you off screen by accident. So these are signs that I'm getting
I'm still
old.
with you. I'm still with you.
All right, thank you so much. Well, okay, so we've got to the first question, which was, please tell us about yourself. And I think it's time we got into the meat of the discussion and what triggered this conversation. So it was really around what is happening to Black people in China. And like I said earlier, around early April, we started hearing all these stories that people are being discriminated. And I think the backstory, which I read on CNN, was that about 111 people tested positive for COVID-19. And so there was this mass testing of Africans. About 4,000 or 5,000 Africans were tested. People were being evicted from their homes. People were being, barred from entering shops. So can you just help us understand, having lived in China, what is the backstory? So starting with, why Gwangju? Is this only in Gwangju? What's really happening?
So I think the focus on Guangzhou has been largely because you have quite a big African community living in Guangzhou, but it doesn't really represent, it doesn't do justice to the number of Africans that are based, for instance, in northern China. Maybe predominantly most of them are students up north in China and Liaoning. You have pockets of Africans living in Shanghai. You have pockets of Africans living in many parts, even on Hainan Island. You have pockets of Africans living in many parts of China. But I think that the focus on Guangzhou came predominantly from some of the, the cases that came out linked to the testing of people, because China was going to do a mass testing, like we will probably undergo in Africa and in some parts of the world where we're in lockdown. As soon as governments open up, they would like to make sure that that everybody's tested in a way to try and control the pandemic as it is. And I think it's all about control. But I think what spared out of control with this is that there was not a lot of information that was shared prior to the testing. So you will see also from official statements that are being given by, let's say, embassies, or statements that will come from authorities like consulates, or and you've also seen the Twitter feed or the social media feed on WhatsApp. My phone was constantly running that week with all sorts of videos being posted. Some of the, obviously, like somebody said to me the other day, are they all true? And the simple answer to that question is, I do not know, but there is no smoke without fire. That's right. What I would say. And therefore, there were some disturbing practices in the way Africans were being treated, I would say, in relation to the whole testing, with people ending up being evicted. I think what also transpired before, because I think what we also need to realize, having lived in China for so many years, is that you have an in-China communication and you have an out-China communication. So right now I'm talking to you on Facebook. It's not something you can easily do in China. You don't have access to Facebook. You don't have access to Google. That means you also don't have access to Twitter. You don't have access to a lot of outside, or what they would call Western social media. And so what is in China is Chinese social media, Chinese internet, that has the same, that plays the same functions as Western, as it's coined in China. So there was already quite a lot of noise, if I could call that. And when I say noise, I don't mean that it was unjustified, but noise meaning that there was a lot of information that was coming out. Even though I haven't lived in China in the last couple of months, I'm still very much plugged into China. This is something that happens to you, whether you have a love-hate relationship with it, you get very drawn into it. So I'm still very active in a lot of a lot of my circles in China, whether it was related to a small work circle or a network of people that I collaborated with while I was working there, or people that I socialized with in many different ways.
Plugged in, then you're still really plugged into what's happening.
Yeah, that's right. So from the different, so this had actually already started like a week or two ago, where we were having these conversations on these groups and saying, what's really going on? What's all this feed coming up, showing this maltreatment? And we were still trying to digest and understand what was happening. And it seemed as though there had been a backstory to the backstory. And it was sort of a lot of it related to some rumors that had gone out on the Chinese internet about persons having escaped quarantine, and then leading on to other stories that went to say a couple of foreigners walked into a restaurant, and these foreigners were Africans, and then a couple of days later, the owner of the restaurant and I think also a family member were infected. So these kind of stories sort of circulating
by
around.
Africans? So is the inference that they were infected by Africans?
So the inference is that Africans had been to that restaurant, and a few days later, this family had been infected. So these are the kind of stories, Another story that came out that I think is still gaining ground on whether it's confirmed or not, is that a COVID patient bit a nurse. And there are pictures on the Chinese internet going around with a face of somebody showing some bite marks. So I think this kind of thing created some kind of maybe outrage on the other side. So this is more on the Chinese camp. And then that fueled with the number. You should remember that at this point in time, the number of cases in China had started slowly going down, and China had, so to say, started having newly imported cases. And therefore, that's how the official information sort of came on to say that they were obviously, like other countries did, testing people who had arrived. And information came out saying, there were so many numbers of new infections, and X number of these were Africans. So I think that in this whole statement, even though the majority of the newly imported cases were Chinese, the predominant feature among the foreigners was the African group. And coupled with all these other stories that were going around, I think then it resulted into this behavior that people related with the mass testing. So I think it's a coincidence of events, and there is also an issue of a mismanagement maybe of the process. So there was not a lot of information, for instance, given out to the consulates on how the process will go on for the mass testing, because maybe that would have been a way to introduce the ambitions of the local authorities in Guangdong province, and Guangzhou is in Guangdong province, so that's why there's such a highlight around Guangzhou, and some of the videos were emanating from Guangzhou.
So why Guangzhou though? Because I read a CNN report again that said 320,000 Africans either enter or leave China from Guangzhou. So why is it such a big deal for African community there?
Well, Guangzhou has an interesting flow of migrants, if I could put it that way. Is that you have an interesting mix of short-term traders. So in Zambia, there's a very famous word, makwebo. When people go for makwebo, they end up predominantly going to Guangzhou, even though they would go to other places within China. It's the export city for China as well. It's also the place. It's sort of like a one-stop shop. And if I can give an equivalent of Amazon to the Western world. In China, it's in China you have a platform. One of the platforms is called Taobao. I think for an African, it would feel like, actually, the better expression for this would be Alibaba. It's like walking into an Alibaba city. So you find all sorts of different things, all well positioned for you, with a lot of Chinese traders that have also sometimes even learned the language. I have friends from Tanzania who would tell me that they're dealing with suppliers in China who have even learned some Swahili. Some friends from Rwanda who would tell you, yeah, they know a supplier in China that, who does freight, who can converse in a bit. So because Chinese are traders and they do know how to engage with their clients. So you have that group of traders, whether they're short-term or long-term. You also have a group of migrants, another group of migrants who would be students. So you have a big student population there that are studying in universities, whether they're financed on Chinese scholarships, because this is another, I think, important element of the China-Africa relations, is that China provides a lot of scholarships to to people of African descent. So if you're an African national, through your bursary, whether in whichever channel it's done, you can receive different types of scholarships.
And I think that's an important point to elaborate on, because I know that apparently the last stats I read was that there are almost 90,000 African students in China, and about 50,000 scholarships were given to African scholars in the last decade. And now China is the #1 destination for African university students. I think people need to understand that, because if this is a trend that's going to continue and you've got scholarships on the table and it's more affordable for people to go and get an education if there's a scholarship on the table. So what's going to happen, like if this pattern continues? And in this pattern, so I think people also want to understand, is this an issue that has just been blown out of the water because of COVID-19? To what extent has it always been there?
So I was just trying to address the first part of your question. I mean, China is trying to be a leader in providing higher education, or let's say vocational education as well, for the world. I would say you would be very surprised, and one of the things that you learn. I made a lot of different friends in China who are coming from European countries or who are American, because they're studying on a scholarship, because China does provide quite a number of scholarships to different countries. But yes, you're right that a lot of African students have had that opportunity. But this is not something that just started yesterday. I think it's been something that's been embedded in the friendship that China has with African countries. So I think drawing on that, you would have it's quite easy to find populations of African students in several Chinese cities, even in places that are not very popular. The first thing that people will ask you when you arrive in Beijing is they would say, "Hey, so how often do you go to Guangzhou?" And I would say, "Do you know that it takes 4 hours by plane to get to Guangzhou?" And things like this. And you have to get maybe on a train for 8 hours plus for you to get to the other side, and not to mention going up country, up north. So I think it's quite interesting that China provides this because then it creates a population of these students. And I think in Guangzhou you have some, but you also do have African migrants that have traveled to China for whatever purpose they arrived there, and they ended up getting married to a Chinese. It's very normal. So you have African Chinese families. So I think that and as natural as it would be in some cities, I think for, I work on migration, you do sometimes tend to find bigger populations around certain types of cities, depending on the trend and the flows, because people look for connection as well, and things to do. So Guangzhou is a place where there's a lot of things to do. So naturally, you would have a bigger population, just not of African migrants, but also foreign migrants in general.
So going back to this question, right? So obviously, I don't want people to kill me and say you didn't answer the question about racism and what's been happening to Black people. So I have two questions for you related to this. Number one is just, what is the Chinese government doing about this? Because people are angry. I've been tweeting as well and saying I'm not seeing enough action. So what is the Chinese government and even the African embassies and consulates in China, what are they doing to actually stop this? Number one. And number two, is this a question of racism or is it xenophobia? Because around the world, as a result of COVID, we're seeing a lot of countries becoming increasingly nationalistic. So I don't want people to leave the show thinking it's only Africans, if it really is a wider question of xenophobia. So if you could please help me answer those two questions.
So I think thinking about the first question, I think I would probably answer the China-Africa response to this issue. I think that it's one of the first times, because there have been a couple, living in China, you do see, I saw maybe one bigger incident that happened around the Black race, if I could put it in that way, that at some point, again, in the same kind of social networks that you're in, you would have expected a bigger reaction from, let's say, the Black community, if you would like. But that's the story that we'll talk about in the next season. And around that, but I think this is one of the very first times that you felt that a particular group of people were targeted, and you actually had a joint effort that came from various China-based African embassies that came together and were demanding answers to this treatment, whether it was justified or unjustified. So meaning that if the feed that they were getting was confirmed or not. So in the same way that we received the information that came on, they decided to respond to it. And their response was to basically ask the other side of the table, the Chinese, to say, hey, what's going on and how are you going to put a stop to this? And they did this in various ways. The African Union has a representation in China, and I think they led a lot of the discussions on the African side. And they had these discussions. You had also from the Chinese side, I mean, you had statements, and people can always feel free to. I always say, China has also, I mean, even though it's very much Chinese based, a lot of the information, there is also a lot of information in English. So the foreign affairs, the foreign minister on the foreign affairs page has posted a statement on the issue itself, as well as the assistant minister in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So these are official statements that they would see, both really very much condemning nation and asking for a stop to it, and basically showing that they were not going to support it, and this was not the official stance. And I think that was a very important thing to happen. Then back on the continent, I think what also happened is a reaction that you hardly didn't see. Like you just said, you said that the stories were coming out only about in April, and I think in China people had already began to have the sense of this uncomfortable feeling, whether it was through Twitter videos or whatever it is was happening, even in people's daily lives. You have people telling you, I just went out on the street, I went to a supermarket today, and can you believe it, the same supermarket I've been going to for 5 years, today the owner just told me, you can't walk in today,
and is this just Black people or just generally foreigners?
So from reactions that I know of and that I've read of as a personal account, so I would say sort of primary information, it would be both. It would be the wider group of foreigners, so it would be Caucasian as much as it would be an Ethiopian, as much as it would be a Black American, as much as it would be a South African reporting these kind of incidents. But of course, the degree does vary. So I think it's also very important to put that to light, that the degree of attention does very much vary. But then, of course, I always say that information is also power. And so you also see it very much reported and very much prominent in the Black communities that are there around in China, that were sort of upfront in sharing their experience.
So what should they be doing then? What do they need to do to get around this issue and go through? I mean, obviously, COVID-19 is still with us. What practical steps should they be taking other than seeking out official communication? And apologies, I will post the website to the official government announcement after this podcast. But what should they be doing to get comfort around, how they're being treated?
I think one of the best comforts you can get is actually coming from where the steam started off from, which was a statement that was made from the Guangdong Foreign Affairs Office, that in one of those sections, very categorically and in English, that's actually both in English and in Chinese, the translation is quite on point, brings out the fact that discriminatory behavior is just not acceptable in China, which was a very important statement to come out. And I think they also went one step further by, offering support in multi-languages for a hotline for any foreigner that felt that their rights had been violated in one way or another, or they were discriminated against, or there was any treatment that was due to them, given to them because of the color of their skin, or because of the way that they looked, or because of the passport that they carried. So that was also very important. I think another message that it sends out, do you remember also that China being quite an important pool of migrants has also managed to accumulate a number of what you would call irregular migrants. So
Oh, I don't know if we've lost Paddy. Hello, Paddy? Okay, we're going to try and reconnect her onto the show because she seems to have dropped off. I'm trying to see if there are any questions from viewers. So we've got a question on the... Okay, so I'm going to show this Facebook question from David. Where is Paddy joining from tonight? So Paddy's actually joining us from Malaysia, where she's now based. So she was previously based in Tanzania, China before, and she moved to KL only late last year. Please post any questions that you might have onto the wall so that we can, once I get her back on, we can answer your questions. And so the idea for tonight was to give a more holistic view of what's actually happening in China. Hi, just give me a second.
One way or another. I think I'm supposed to be touching my camera to let it know that I'm here. So it kind of, went away. Sorry about that.
I was like, people in Africa are going to laugh at us because we're not supposed to have power problems or have any internet problems, bandwidth. And here we are in Singapore and KL and not able to carry on a conversation. But thank you for joining us. I just answered a question that David Mungle had asked, so where you're joining, and you're in KL. So do you want to just continue?
Yes, I was going to continue. And I think, I was going to say that one of the important reactions that had happened on the African continent itself is that, various foreign ministers of affairs in different African countries, in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Kenya, to mention among the few, summoned, which is a big word in diplomatic circles, the Chinese ambassador. And in some cases, you even had, you had dignitaries sort of, listening to these Twitter feeds, sitting together and say, have you seen this video? And, what reaction, what are we going to do about this? And I think that already is a very important step because, I keep on saying that it doesn't matter how many cases there were out there. It doesn't matter if one woman on the street was left out with her baby. It doesn't matter if only one person was kicked out of their apartment. It doesn't matter if one lady was allowed to enter the subway because of the color of her skin. It really doesn't matter if it's 4 or 5 foreigners who were stopped walking into a restaurant. What matters is that a human has been denied the right to live their life like anyone else. So they've been discriminated against. Yeah. So I think but this work has a lot to do with sensitizations. Human behavior is something that's very, it's very interesting. I wish, in another life I would have studied psychology like one of my sisters did. I hope she's joining us soon and she's probably going to ask me one of these trick questions. But, I think we also tend, you asked where it has emanated from. I think it emanated from fear, Muloongo, Yeah. A lot of times when you don't have information, a lot of times when you don't know what's coming to you, also a lot of people had been living in lockdown for a very long time, and then you see the number of imported cases increasing, and then you see, there they are. That's a group that we could check. Oh, look, this is what's happening to them. So if I'm a landlord, what do? Kick somebody out because I don't have more information. But guess what now? Nobody can be able to do that. And if they do, there's a place to go. So I think there's a joint responsibility that comes both, it starts from the migrant themselves. So I was talking about irregular migration at some point, and I was saying, fine, let mass testing go ahead. But I think mass testing should not be confused with what's the legality of your passport, because that would just encourage more people to hide away. Yeah. So if I'm an illegal migrant, I'm going to hide away from the testing. And then it defeats the purpose of making sure that there's mass testing, because there will be a pocket of people who are important, and to check what is their health status. And that also means that if they get sick, they can't get access to any kind of healthcare. And if they can infect their neighbors without having known, but if they did know through a test, it would be much easier. But that passport, the need to show the passport, gives a lot of fear. So I think because of this fear, it gave a lot of people taking law into their hands. So I also think that the next step that would happen is just sensitization among, from the African embassies that are there, and I think a lot of them are doing a good job on the ground. I'm still very much in touch with my Zambian ambassador on my side, who, with a very vibrant student associations that are around, checking on their people. And I think that's also very important. I know the Kenyans have a students association as well. The Tanzanians have a student association. So I think these student associations can be used as a channel to provide information to say, hey, are your rights being violated? I think there's also various migrant groups that are there, diaspora communities that are there. I was part of a community. I was even part of the East African women's community. It was not formal, but it's formal enough that you can get this information. Then I think on the Chinese side, they would understand what needs to be done, because I think it's also very important to say, how can we get through this? How can we get through this? And I think it's an important question that many countries are asking themselves right now.
Well, I'm really encouraged by your response, because I think and my dad is on this. He's actually watching this live, and my dad was a diplomat, and I have a lot of respect and time for diplomats. But I think that people have this misconception that the African embassies are not doing enough. So maybe what they need to do more of is share what they're doing. And also just to encourage any Chinese students that are actually watching the show is that the onus is on you to also get in touch with the Chinese, with your embassy and consulate, and also seek information from the government on what your rights are. I think that's really important. So I actually wanted to pivot slightly. So we were talking earlier about the Chinese community in Africa, and depending on whether the stats are right or not, but Wikipedia says there are about 2 million Chinese people living in Africa, with big populations in Ghana, which apparently has 700,000 Chinese people, 300,000 to 400,000 in South Africa, and another 100,000 or so in Namibia and Madagascar. So I saw an article early last week, I think, the Chinese community in Ghana donating stuff to help the fight of COVID-19 in the local community. But do you think that they're nervous about what's actually happening to Africans in China, and whether there'll be any repercussions for them in Africa?
Well, I think that just when COVID broke out, so before it was declared a pandemic, there was a lot of discriminatory action towards Chinese and Asians in general. I think this is something that we saw, whether it was posted on Twitter with, people sending messages to sort of condemn this kind of behavior, and to also condemn that, basically COVID doesn't carry a nationality. It's stateless. And therefore it's not an Asian carrying it. It's not a Chinese person carrying it. And I have to say that I think the reactions that I saw from Africa were very, very mild compared to some of the reactions that you saw, for instance, in the US, or in pockets, in parts in Europe, where people would be seen really physically distancing away themselves every time they saw an Asian or a Chinese. And these are videos. I'm referring to information that I saw, whether it would be mainly on social media. But I think a lot of that didn't come out because I think, Africans are used to living with Chinese side by side. Because they are our biggest trading partner. And, for a very long time, they have been coming onto the continent, and now we're traveling their way, So we're filling gaps in their communities and society, and they're doing the same back home. And whether it's justified or not, that's a discussion for another day. So I think in terms of, living side by side, I think people have been comfortable. Of course, there were some notions that people felt uncomfortable. In some conversations, you would have people saying, but they shouldn't really lock us down because, we don't really receive Chinese people coming here. So there was a lot of sensitization actually that went on also on the African side, to sensitize people to say COVID is not carried by a Chinese, COVID is just carried by a body, and that body doesn't have to be identified by its passport. So I think that, a lot of communities, because of the proximity in which we live, our communities, so, Chinese will be either small traders, or there will be, high-level investors or whatever it is. I mean, I haven't confirmed it with a Chinese person that I've spoken to, but I would say that I think the reaction has been quite different from what we saw from the other side.
Oh, that's really good. So I'm going to pivot to questions on Facebook, and we've got a question from Judy, who's asking, besides students on scholarships, what are so many Africans doing in China? Thank you for the question,
They are living life. Somebody told me something. This is very interesting. And they said, come to China to live the American dream. And because China is that kind of a place, China is the kind of place where there's still a lot of opportunities that you could tap into. There's a lot of opportunities that you could tap into as a foreigner. Yes, there are challenges, just like in many other places. So it doesn't come on a silver plate. But people do try different things. Predominantly, people would arrive as students. They would study there for a couple of years. And the Chinese have been allowing some kind of integration of students a little bit slowly over the years. It used to be that when your visa expired, the next day you should pack your bags and go. So when your student visa is done and you've graduated, basically you should pack your bags and be heading back home the next day. But they've opened up that in parts here and there where you can stay on a bit and do an internship or do a bit of work. So some are working, some are just living life like Muloongo and I are doing here in Kuala Lumpur and in Singapore. So I think there are many. This is the thing about China, that you arrive and you do tend to see that people are involved in many different types of economic activity, and it's predominantly to make a living. Yeah, so that's what people are doing in China, different things.
Okay, no, that's great. And I wanted to ask you a question. In general, how did you find living in Beijing? What did you learn? What do you miss about living there?
Oh, I had a picture close by, and but then I couldn't find it. I will see before the end. Maybe when we go on a break, I will grab the picture, and it can just give you a depiction of what it was. So you know what I miss? I think living in Beijing was a test of your personality. It tests you because you you arrive in a city and you think because it's, you know, it's one of the top 10 cities in the world, so everybody will be speaking English. It doesn't happen that way. So you have to learn to navigate in Mandarin or in Chinese. So that was a bit of a shock to me, but it was also a beauty in understanding a bit of the language. I didn't have the opportunity to study Chinese as much as I would have wanted because I had a small baby when I arrived. But I found a lot of joys. I found a lot of joys in the parks that they have as a city. It's got quite a number of widespread parks. There's a lot of diversity in its food, you know, not just Beijing, not just food from Beijing, but food from China. And Muloongo, you will know this living in Singapore, Chinese food outside the country has got nothing to do with Chinese food in China. So you can go very, you know, very spicy to the Sichuan side of things. And you can go, and if you enjoy lamb like I do, you go to parts of Inner Mongolia and you enjoy lamb in many different flavors, and even in ways that I have not eaten lamb before. So, you know, you have such a diversity in food. And then you have you also have a lot of interest in people, you know, that they're very different types of Chinese people and people who come from different cities seeking a life of a city life. So we lived in Beijing and it's predominantly city, and we lived also in the city center. So we had good flavors of it. Another thing is that I've never made so many expert friends like I did in China. I think language had one thing to do with it in the very beginning. Sense of belonging had another thing to do with it. So I met a lot of different friends and met a lot of different people. And there was just, yeah, there's so many things to be interested in. And the country itself, you know, how they managed to pull a large pool of people out of poverty. You know, these are lessons that, you know, you see in the work ethic of people. That's the thing. There's efficiency. There's a lot of speed in movement. We're not really dragging our feet when we walk. Yes, it depends on where you go, but predominantly, at least the places I went to, people didn't drag their feet as much as, you know, in other parts that I have been to in my life.
And that's something you can learn in Africa, right? The work ethic of Chinese is very strong. I mean, you see companies, a lot of these big PPE projects that we have, people come with their own people, and we wonder why. But you know, they work really hard. They're very diligent. Do you know where that comes from? Like, what is it in the Chinese culture that makes them so diligent in what they do and super efficient?
I think there was a drive to want to move to the next level. In the previous generation, there was a very big drive to just want to get out of it, to get out of poverty. And then, of course, they have the way their society is also framed, the way their society is governed, has a big part to do with that, because they do tend to send out very strong messages on the benefit of working together for the general good. So I think that does something in driving people. I also think that people have, after they've lived in poverty for such a long time, they do then respect the authority that they have. And I'm talking about, yes, they may be outliers of this. So I think people should take this information with a pinch of salt and do their own research and reading. But I think that, you know, you have a pocket of people who say, we're doing fine, you know, we came from somewhere and we're here. There's still a lot of development work in some parts, because people still need to get some parts, because it's not 100% like no country is, you know, poverty free. So there is some work to learn from there, but how you organize your society, how you want to move to the next step. China is also trying to be quite, to move away from this notion that they are just a copy paste kind of place, and, you know, to look a bit further into being much more innovative and building these innovation cities, and, you know, coming up very strongly on that as well. So there is a lot to learn about that. So that work ethic, I think, was something that was interesting for me, particularly in government as well, because the work that I did allowed me to interact with government. And another thing was that they just knew what they wanted. They may not tell you, what they want. But they knew what they wanted, and therefore you were not going to tell them that what you wanted is what they want, which is something that I think African countries, we are now coming to terms with. You know, when I sit and I'm listening in these days to webinars with whether it's the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and you really hear how strong we are. It's the African Union, or it's the African Union and African heads of state negotiating their stance with Europe, for instance. I think our messages have become very different. You know, it really is much more of a strategic cooperation from our side, because for a long time, I think you had things not handed to you, but we were just a little bit slower on the writing side, you know, on the analytical side of things, and we are sharper. You know, we are sharper. It's been many years of development relationship, if we can call it that, and we're becoming sharper. So I think there are a lot of things we can learn about that, about living in Beijing. But you know, I was also going to say that on being resilient. You know, I think China taught me about resilience. Like you, Muloongo, my grandparents actually lived in China in the 80s. So I had some very big footsteps to follow there. A very long discussion with my grandmother before I left for China. I remember with my 4-month-old baby and thinking, Grandma, I'm going to this place. And she said, you will love it. She was not bored for one day.
Wow.
And I will tell you that I was never bored, not even for a day in China, because you just found things to do, things to discover about yourself that maybe you liked or didn't, things to discover about the Chinese that you liked or didn't. But there were just so many other interesting things to see. So yeah, my grandmother was very right. I was never bored in China.
Oh, that's really good to know. So today, actually, ironically, if COVID-19 hadn't broken out, today I was supposed to be landing in Beijing for the very first time. So I had planned a 10-day trip through Beijing, seeing everything from the Great Wall to Forbidden Palace, and then taking the train down to Cheyenne to see the Terracotta Warriors, and then going to Chengdu to see the panda bears. But my uncle also told me that Chengdu is where the museum that shows the Chinese people who built railway lines in Zambia is based. And then I was going to go to Shanghai. So I'm really fascinated by China and what they've developed. I'm fascinated by the technology they have. So it's ironic that you said copy and paste is the reputation they have. But you know, while the rest of the world is still doing facial recognition on the street, China is looking at body movements. So they've evolved. And as someone who works in banking, a lot of the tech that they're using is just so incredibly sophisticated compared to what we're seeing elsewhere. I mean, you have beggars using QR codes, which I find fascinating, and markets where they use QR codes. So I think the world has a lot to learn about China. So pivoting slightly, and by the way, please start your screen so we don't go off again. I just wanted to check with you. So you've lived in Tanzania, you've now lived in China and currently in Malaysia. So how do you actually compare the experience of being an expat in Africa versus an expat in Asia? Like the pros, the cons, what you learn, and what the general experience is.
Well, I think I got cultural shock when I moved to Tanzania, simply because I took it for granted that I would be fitting in a sleeve. Because I thought it was very familiar. I also thought that it was very close to home. I thought that it was a place that I would easily blend in. But I think what I found out was that it took a bit of time, but I lived there 7 years. So it was very good. I immersed myself in Swahili, and that really switched up and touched up, which I still, I think I reached a point where I was dreaming in Swahili. And then I knew, you know, when I told my colleague, I said, I dreamt in Swahili. She said, you've arrived, you know. So these are some of the things. So I think comparing is difficult. Comparing is difficult because it was also different phases in my life. I wasn't a mother in Tanzania. And you know, and when I was in Tanzania, I traveled to Kenya, I traveled to Ethiopia for work. So these were some of the places that I went to. So I had different liberties. So I think that there was a lot of learning that I could do professionally. So I also found that living in Africa, there was a lot of learning to do, and there's so much opportunity that, you know, that Africans have in terms of just learning the lessons that we have on the continent itself, if we have to replicate them back home. And I'm talking about the development space. I think, Muloongo, you'd probably agree with me also in the banking sector. I think there's a lot of intra-learning that we can do. I think being an expat in Asia, what is different is the food. You know, I am a foodie. I am so much a foodie, and I love my African food. But I got a taste to the Asian flavors, and I think they're very special flavors. I think my children prefer Asian flavors. Any day they will dream noodles. Any day they want to eat jiaozi, which is dumplings. So, you know, I think yeah, those are the parts, and then parenting as well. I think parenting styles are very different between on the Asian side and African side, but there are some points of similarity. Discipline, for instance, is something I think both sides really do value, even though we have different degrees to it. We also have different approaches.
Are we harsher? African parents harsher?
I think African parents are more direct. They are much more direct. Asian parents are very engaged. So if they wanted you to get a grade, they will escort you to the class. They would check your work. African parents are very vocal. And it's not to do with my parents. It's sort of to do with, you know, my experience of seeing different people parenting, because I think voice really speaks a lot. Eyes spoke a lot in the African sense. And even my eyes today, listen, I have become my mother. My eyes speak. I'm very surprised that they speak to my children. So these are some of the
hand raise. Sometimes all you have to do is get the hand
exactly.
and they know.
Yeah, that's true. That seems to, and then, you know, but I think Asian families are much more involved. I would also say that Asian grandparents are much more involved in the parenting. That's one thing that I found on the Asian side of things, at least also in China, and I see it here in Kuala Lumpur as well, that, you know, when grandparents are close by, they're very much engaged in what they do.
Not to say same house.
So that's the level of engagement, I would say. So if I had a child, and I mean, I have 2 kids, and even if my parents lived in the same town, for instance, they wouldn't move town to where I am. And there were many of my Chinese friends that I could count that their mother moved even in the same compound, that they were neighbors, because it's about proximity. But remember, I was also dealing with a lot of families that would have been the only child, or there are only 2 kids. This would be the only child. So that probably is the only grandchild, or the second grandchild. So there's also all these elements that come to you. So it's also the number of children. That's something that's also, you know, that amazes you to see. But it's refreshing here to see in Malaysia, where Malaysians are quite close to the Africans. I think they're very productive, and that's quite refreshing to see, because sometimes in China you would walk around with your big belly. You know, you were talking about my experience in China, and I have my toddler and my stomach, and I would have 2 grandmothers looking at me and thinking, where is her mother and where is her mother-in-law? Because everybody is involved in parenting, you know. So this is the level that you go into, where I think in the African sense, they check on you, they come to see you, but there's still a little bit of distance. There's still a little bit of respect, you know. They don't come with you for your appointment. And many times I sat, and this is private hospitals, that I would walk in, and there would be 2 mothers-in-law, a mother-in-law, a mother sitting somewhere next to a pregnant woman. So, you know, I think it's in this time. So the support systems are definitely different.
Is the divorce rate high? Because I can't imagine that's a conducive environment for men, having their mothers, their mother-in-law, and their wives in such close proximity. Is the rate of divorce high in China?
So maybe the key word is resilience.
So maybe I think African men in China to learn a bit more resilience.
Really, I think that some of the Chinese friends that I have encountered with the mother-in-law, they have higher levels of tolerance, and they have higher levels of resistance. Not to say anything about mothers-in-law, because you can also have a great mother-in-law. But I think, like I do, but it's also something, you know, even your own mother. I think my mother would like space from me after 3 days, because she wouldn't want to child me in my own home. So I think we just have a very different lineage. But of course, yes, it's true that I'm also talking of a setting of a you know, this is a middle class family here. And I think in Africa, you know, and even in parts of Asia, they are low income families that would still have a much more closer connection, I would say, if you like, in terms of how you raise your kids. kids, so they might be in their face or even living in their house. You know, in Zambia, it's very common also at some point to have like your mother-in-law helping you with the kids because you have to go to work and you cannot afford a maid, for instance. So that means that they are very heavy-handed. My parents in the UK, my parents live in the UK, and I have, you know, 3 of my sisters, 2 of them with kids, and my brother also has a daughter, and my parents are also very much involved there. So, you know, where you don't have the extended family, yes, and yes, it is true that you do tend to differ with your parents on parenting skills, but you do have a level of compromise. But I just saw it a bit more different on the Asian front. So divorce rate is something difficult to say, but I do think that people tend to live a little bit more separate lives later. But it's a different thing to say. I think of, or if I have a statistic to say, I think of the few Chinese friends that I have, only one got divorced years after having the child, and she didn't live with her mother-in-law, so it's not nothing to say. So it's difficult. It's difficult.
Okay, I'm going to go to the wall and look at questions. And so we've got another question from Judy, who's asking, what do you make of Chinese coming to Africa to hawk eggs and secondhand clothes? It's okay for them to come and build that infrastructure, but taking over our small businesses, that's a bit too much. Thoughts?
I had to take a sip there. So, I mean, I think it's two-sided. I always say that a Chinese investor, so whether he's a micro investor or a medium investor or a high-end investor, would not walk into the country without the Zambian authorities opening one door or another, whether it's through the investment center or an immigration officer or however it is done. So I think there's a lot to say about how that is managed. So I think that in countries where they have managed it well, they really do record what foreign businesses are eligible to do and what they are not eligible to do.
Yeah.
And I think there have been different versions of this story. And the story goes like this. A Chinese or let's say an Asian foreign investor comes in, because I think it could also happen with a European investor, comes in and says, I'm going to build a factory. and they go through an investment center.
Okay.
And then after, with the investment center, you end up that it was not a factory, and then it ends up being a restaurant. And then it ends up that actually they were not going to employ 500 people, but they actually only employed 20 people, or they employed only, and of those 20 people, 5 people came from their country. But who allows and who is there to monitor this whole activity? So I think sometimes it's very easy for us to throw the stone on the other side. Not to say that it's justified, but I think that people will be out there to look for a livelihood. So if they think that there is an opportunity in Africa to open a small business, they will take advantage of that opportunity. But we have a responsibility as the local authority that grants business licenses to understand what kind of businesses and who should be running them. And you've seen outrage. I saw outrage not too long ago from Kenya, where, you know, Chinese stores, I think, were almost being burnt if they were not burnt, because there's no communication. So that's another thing. When investors are coming in, I think there's not just a responsibility to hand them out licenses, but to sensitize the other local traders, because it simply looks as though foreigners are coming to take over their businesses, and you don't want to allow the politics to come and play here, because I think that in one way or another there could be a space for everyone, but it has to be very well managed. So I'm not very good in throwing the blame game. Sorry about this, because a lot would say, yeah, they shouldn't come, you know, they should just stay home.
I think Molly agrees with you. So we've got someone here from Molly saying, if I'm local.
We have that responsibility. Remember, we are also sitting on the other side of the table. We're issuing business licenses, or if we're not issuing business licenses, we're going every day and people are paying for that little store. Should we ask some questions of how things want to be done? And that's communicated very well. But I think it's something in Zambia, you know, that we also saw with, you know, in many different phases, that it even went to the political level. And, you know, that's maybe not a discussion for this forum.
So please keep the questions coming, those of you who are online, because it's really interesting, and also the feedback as well. So just another question for you. I mean, you've been abroad for a while, so similar to me. And so how do you stay connected with Zambia and make sure that you're still, you know, in touch with people, you're still vested in the country's development, that you're still on top of issues and contributing as an individual?
So I'm very thankful for technology. by the time I moved to Tanzania, WhatsApp was on, but it was not as, it doesn't have as many diverse functions as it used to have. I mean, its functions have become much more diverse than it was previously. So WhatsApp has been one area to keep in touch with family. Emails, but I don't write as many anymore. So because WhatsApp has taken over with videos. And remember, I also do have family a little bit spread around the world. So that also makes it easier. I have to say, in these COVID times, Zoom has become a feature, not just for me, but also for my children who are privileged to have Zoom meetings with their teachers. So Zoom has been one place that we keep in touch. I visit home quite. I'm quite a regular. If we don't go twice a year, at least we go once. It's a pity now. We will see what happens with COVID and how it affects our travel. So this is how I try to keep in touch. Facebook, even though when we're in China, Facebook, Instagram, I wasn't very active. Same with Twitter, because you just don't have access to them while you are in China unless you try other means. So so this is how I've kept in touch. And I think, phone calls, you would still be surprised that people were still able to give you a phone call. But I always say that when you land home, you make connection, and I still have a lot of big connection to my high school friends that I went to school with 22 years ago. I still have a lot of connection with former colleagues in Zambia. But I'm a person who likes to stay connected, and I'm an extrovert. So I enjoy that. And I also feel, in contributing back, I feel that I have big shoes to fill. I just feel that I could do much more than just in my professional life, and I do try to get linked up with research institutions or think tanks that are working around issues of local economic development. It's sort of a passion that's on my heart, and I try to also put my two worlds together. Like I said in my intro, I work on migration, and then I'm also an economist. So bringing those two worlds together, and the natural place is remittances. So I'm very much interested in what we give back home. What are we sending back home, and how does that spur up economic development? It's something that I learned and that I saw very vividly in China. You've had literally cities coming up because of remittances. Wow. Life coming out of them. And there's a lot of economic activities. And now in these days of COVID, I think we will see a slowdown in that, unfortunately, because migrants won't just have that opportunity. I mean, they would just not have that opportunity as much as they did before, either because wages are going to be cut, or because they're going to lose their jobs, or one way or another stringent measures are coming. So we're hoping that governments, just keep their eyes up and take care of migrants, because we are important in making a positive contribution, not just where we are, but home. So the livelihood really strings along a very long way. And sometimes I would say it's not just where it ends up in the big city where I'm coming from. It also can go down all the way to where my village is. But I think we do have a responsibility.
So we've got a question in from Benard, who's asking, how can the youthful generation of African continent get space to explore into the technology and be accepted, rather than being dependent on foreign technologies, which makes us slaves of other races?
Interesting. It's a fully packed question because it has a lot of different things, but I'll try to answer it as best as I read it. And I'm trying to read it at the same time as you were. Exploring into technology. Well, we have some global leaders. But there are countries like Rwanda that will show you that they can learn from a global leader, and then they can come up with their own local solutions. And I think without even having to cross the continent, you could go to places like that. You could find out what is the buzz in terms of the use of technology in innovative ways. How do we use technology in business? How can we enhance the use of technology in the healthcare sector?
You had made a really good point related to this when we had a conversation before about what Rwandese students are coming to study in China compared to, say, what the Zambian or other countries are coming to study, because this is kind of linked to the technology question.
True. So I was going to come to that and say, so I think it comes on what our governments, but also what our parents want us to invest into. I think that there has been, the traditional ones have been, you should be an economist, a doctor, a nurse, the very big traditional ones. And when IT was spurring up onto the continent, people were like, can you really find a job in IT that sustains you in the same way as being a teacher, in the same way as, being a banker? You need to choose an industry that will give you a job that's that's much more sustainable. But I think there is something to be said about technology, because look at us, we are talking through technology. Had COVID happened and we didn't have this technology, so many things wouldn't be happening. So many things, so many people would be left out and trapped out of information. So many people would be trapped out and left out of healthcare services. So I think, and even though there's so much more we can do here, China offers various scholarships, and I think it's also about what governments can negotiate to the powers that be. And in technology, we know the Silicon Valley, we know India has Bangalore there, we know the US, we know what's fetching out in Europe. So how can we tap into that knowledge and bring it back and come up with some more localized solutions? Because then that makes us less dependent on foreign technologies. But be mindful, we can't operate within a vacuum. So we still would need them, because they would have maybe gone one step ahead. But just look at mobile money. Mobile money, I would say there's an argument that goes around. It started in India, but somebody said, no, in Africa, we had already started it before. We had started way before, but we were just not informing people about what we were doing. When I moved from Tanzania to China, it was very easy. It was a very fluid and easy move, because all I did is I was on M-Pesa. In those days, it used to be M-Pesa or Airtel Money or whichever mobile service carrier, everything on your mobile phone. And in China, I could move with just that mobile phone, nothing else. Make my payments, call friends. Okay, I also needed a power bank, because that's what you do all the time. You're constantly on your phone for your bus ticket, for everything that you needed. You had your mobile phone. Even in the market, like you said, beggars, QR code. So how do we leverage the way technology is being used and just bring it back for the local problems that we have, and create some local solutions out of it? So I think not too much borrowing. And I think you can also see it right now with COVID. The big thing that everybody's crying for is data, and saying, how will we reach people in local villages if we have to go for mass testing? If they don't even have IDs, how do we find them? What kind of technology? So I think it's already an outcry coming out from African governments and saying, how are we going to reach these people? And so the youthful generation, whether you work in technology or whether you're a data scientist or whatever it is you're doing, get onto those webinars. You have the time now. Search around and see, listen to what global leaders are saying, and then put in your proposals wherever they are. Yes, all dreams are valid. And like I said, people in China, they show you that you have to have zeal and you have to have passion in a dream that you have, and that actually stops us making a slave of our own race, because sometimes we're a slave to ourselves, because it's all embedded with the fear, but we can learn from many. We can learn from Ghana. We can learn from, there are examples in South Africa. Look now with the testing kits, Senegal is there. South Africa is on the map. Uganda was making ventilators. When you see, it's not even a high-tech technology. You just look at these guys sitting around this thing, you say, can this sustain life? So how are we tapping into these things? So I think it's maybe before we also look at technology, we need to think about the use of the technology so that it allows us, So I was saying to you, Muloongo, when I would meet Rwandese students, one of my best friends in China was from Rwanda. So, I hang around the Rwandese crowd, hey, if they're out there, that I love so much. And it was just always enlightening, when I would meet students studying like solar energy and some kind of very sophisticated form of industrial science or whatever is out there. And I think this is the kind of thing we need to engage in. So it comes from, what are we educating our youth in, and then, because that's what creates our labor force.
I agree with you. And actually, we've got a comment here from Rita online.
Hey, Rita, Mambo VP. That's my friend from Tanzania.
Okay. Hi, Rita. She says, you're very right, Paddy. It's leaping from the technology and adopting to the local content. This is not a one-size-fits-all solution, a forward action. Each African community is unique. I think that's really insightful. And I think one thing that people need to take away as well is, and the strategy that you've outlined, is exactly what China did many years ago when they sent all their students to San Francisco to study at Stanford and went to MIT to learn technology. And now they're actually building up their own universities to train the best students in China. So someone who was an education minister here told me that the best students in China do not go to Ivy League or Oxford universities. They stay in China because they want to make sure that they're growing their own talent, they're harnessing that talent and the technology. And I think it all goes back to, you know, our strategy. What is our government strategy in terms of what are we learning? What tech do we need to develop? So that's really interesting. And I hope people take that away.
And you know what I was going to say, Muloongo? I think there's also something to be said to parents, because I think there's a lot of student comfort zones of where to study. So if you have the opportunity and the privilege to send your child out for an education, it's not the automatic spots. You know, everybody, you know, at some point in Zambia, everybody wanted to go to the UK to study. But then now, you know, you can have a student in Japan. So many African students in Malaysia, African students in Singapore, in Japan, in parts of Southeast Asia, because there's a lot of lessons that you can learn out of it. So I think it's also about parents thinking a little bit outside the box.
I agree.
You know, yes, some of the lands are a bit foreign. We don't know about them. What do they eat? What will my child have? And so on and so forth. But it's all about doing these calculations, you know. Parents sending their children to Cyprus, you know, this is a new destination within the EU that people never used to send their children to before, because it was like, it's different. But, you know, I think it's all about thinking, what can they come back with, you know, equipped with, and be ready to contribute to local economic development, because that's very important. So I think, you know, on the scale, all of us need to let go a little bit of the fears that we have.
And you made another good observation. So apologies, everyone. Paddy and I just met over this topic actually a week ago and have talked every day. And every day she tells me new things. But one of the fascinating things you said to me was that by the time a Chinese kid is a teenager, the parents probably and the grandparents have all gone around looking at schools, and you said how, you know, they went to Oxford or Cambridge on holiday and said, my kid's going to Oxford or Cambridge, and started making a plan towards that many years ahead. And I think just the way they think of the future is really insightful. And I think we need to figure out how can we get best practice and actually help ourselves in Africa make better plans about how we're educating our children. So I know we've gone over time and we've had people drop off. So David's just said goodbye. And so David is someone I work with the Rhodes Trust. He's been fantastic and posting comments. So I know you posted quite a few comments, David. We will come to
Hey, David, thank you.
We've got additional comments. I mean, Molly has come back with another comment that she's made about parents and students are afraid of the unknown. And she's saying she asked a friend to send a child to Japan and she was afraid that she doesn't know anyone. And so what's interesting, again, it comes back to the whole point of Chinese parents, like everybody will get on that plane and go to Japan and check out the school. So I think we all just need to have a vested interest in what our children are going to do. So Judy has come out with feedback and said, your guest is A1. I guess this is like A-star. I'm really excited that you've been able to come on the show and give us some insights about what's happening in China, but also talk about the positives. Because I think some people, when I first posted this topic, thought that this was going to be a China bashing session. I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm actually a huge fan of China. I recognize the pitfalls. I recognize, you know, the human rights challenges. I recognize this racism issue. So I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I tend to look at things, the glass is half full and not half empty. So I focus on the positives and the things that I think Africa can learn from China. And I think that's what we need to do, given that China is, you know, going to be the biggest economy in the world. Sorry, Donald Trump, but it's the truth. And so we should be looking at this in a different way, a way that makes it beneficial for Africa and Africans as well. So I think our governments just need to kind of change the perspective. So final thoughts. I know we've overrun, and that's because we had a tech glitch. But final thoughts from you, like what are the key takeaways you want people to leave this conversation with?
So, you know, when I think about being Black in China, yes, of course, it doesn't take your skin. You move with your skin, but you also represent your race. You know, you represent your race in everything that you do. I dress like this, and I dressed like this in China a lot. I dressed in my African print. I was going to wear African print, but it was probably going to be too colorful for this setting. And that's who I was. But, you know, I also felt that I was a moving education. You feel you're a moving education for people who would have never met an African before in their life. And there are people who have never met African people. China is massive. So you let people get curious about your hair. I let people get curious about hair. Go, oh my gosh, look at this hair. Does it bounce? Is this how you were born? The color of my skin. My children learned it. I was saying to Muloongo earlier on that, you know, one of the things that my kids also learned very earlier on, of course, you know, understanding body space and, you know, respect for the body space. My kids were raised, because I had to work when I was in China, they were raised by a Chinese nanny. And, you know, so their first words were in Chinese. But she became an advocate. You know, she had never worked with an African family before, and she learned a lot of things. She used to mix, for those of you who are from Zambia, she would mix nshima with vegetables and chicken, everything on the plate, because, you know, she learned how to separate the things on the plate. It's very important how a Zambian wants their food to be eaten. So, you know, all these things. And I think there's a learning process from both sides, you know. So when you step out of your zone, and it may not be your comfort zone, but be prepared for what you receive. And then I think you also need to have a pocket where you keep your peace. You know, you also need to know how you guard your peace, how you don't get too much offense. And you know that there are things you can control and things you cannot control. And yes, like I said to Muloongo, there were many times when I got bashed out, or I was called a Black African in the midst of Caucasians, and this could have been in any setting, you know. And I took an opportunity to give an education about what it is, you know. And if the person takes the lesson, that's good. And if they don't, I don't become confrontational about it, because it robs me of my peace. And I come from, you know, a family. My Muloongo, I didn't disclose this to you, but you know, my grandfather is one of the founding leaders of Zambia. So I have a lot of big shoes to fill in. You know, I have I think he's the late Mainza Chona. So, you know, I think he looks at me down and he says, you can do it right. There's a lot of diplomacy that I've learned from him. And, you know, it's also that it's not everything that you think that has to be said. It's about the moment. It's very important that we don't react to everything and respond to everything. But I think there's a lot of benefit in us understanding what we can gain from each other. But let's not kid ourselves. It's a table of negotiation as well in certain issues that are related to the Africa-China front. It's negotiation, but it's what you bring to the table, you know. So we must bring something, you know, so that our friendship grows. And like any friendship, you know, it's a give and take. And sometimes it goes a bit rough, but, you know, we keep on. We don't give up on the friendship, because it's important for us to, you know, to keep going. I don't know, Muloongo, if you wanted me to add anything else from another angle. I feel like we've talked about this subject in the last couple of days.
I know. No, but I completely agree with you. I mean, you and I have been chatting, and I've said that because I've been traveling since I was 2 years old, I've learned to be able to separate, at least when I'm in a situation, I always try to distinguish between ignorance and racism. So I will take a moment before I react. And I've only, you know, I get it. There's always an undercurrent, but I rarely, you know, rise to the occasion, because I think it's not my issue, it's your issue. And unless it's really confrontational, then I generally don't react. And it's interesting what you said about your hair and people touching your skin. So I want to give a shout out to my dad, who's on this discussion. And the reason I'm saying hi to my dad, hi Daddy. My dad has been a diplomat since the 60s. So when he was in the 60s, he was based in Russia, and he said people would come up to him on the street and rub his skin and wonder why it's so dark. And my dad is lighter skinned than I am, and ask him why his skin was so tan and if he hadn't bathed. So people who have been traveling for decades and decades know that you always have to go through this period of adjustment where people are not used to seeing you. So I live in Singapore, which is, you know, pretty multinational and international and plugged in the world. But, you know, when I moved here, people would stare at me on the street. You know, and to this day, they still think I live in, you know, some people ask me where I live and they think I live in some, you know, funny neighborhood. And I'm like, no, I live right next to your presidential palace. Like, I'm not, you know, I'm not in the ghetto. So people have these stereotypes of what a Black African should be. And if you know, if you're too sensitive about it, you will always be in a battle, is what I've taken away from, you know, my 40 years of traveling around the world and living with my parents who are diplomats and government officials. So diplomacy has always been in my family. And so I just, you know, react to things differently. But, you know, I'm really grateful for the time that you've taken to come here and talk. It's been more of a conversation, and if I really wanted, it's like we're sitting in the living room talking, even though we're broadcasting live. So it's been a lot of fun. I know that you and I are going to be on the show a lot, because we have a lot of subjects that we've said we wanted to discuss. So, really, thank you so much for making the time to come and talk to us today. And I look forward to, you know, a growing friendship. We have so much in and comments.
Yes.
I look forward to being friends and hope to see you in person. So, KL
Yes,
is only an
you
hour
are only
away.
Mlongo, you are only 45 minutes from here. So, and I think, one of the responsibilities that we have as people in the diaspora is to make people understand where we are. And sometimes somebody said to me, "Where is Malaysia? Is that like in Russia?" And I'm like, "No, it's actually in Asia. It doesn't sound like it." So I think, we also have a responsibility in posting the pictures that we have of what our real life situation is like
Yeah,
here and sharing that. So yeah, so I'm really looking forward to, engaging more. And I think that the work you're doing at Ongolo is really, really, really interesting. And I've been following you for quite some time. So I was, when we had that automatic link up that came in with, being Black in China, I was like, I take it up because I think it's such an important subject to have a balanced view on.
Well, I just want to end with this comment from my friend Tasma, who says, agree, we are all ambassadors of Africa's expats, and we must represent and show off our cultures. Totally agree with you, Tasma. Thank you so much to everybody who's watched the show. I hope it's been enlightening. And actually, Paddy, I would ask if you could please just look through some of the comments. If there are any questions that we didn't answer, please just maybe just touch base. And also, please post that link to the authorities' website where they condemned, the Chinese authority actually formally condemned these racial acts and given information on what people should do if they're facing this. So any information that you can share will be really helpful. Thank you again for coming. And thank you to everyone who watched. This is my launch episode. So I'm super excited to actually get this up and running. And then next week, let me see if I can find this, but next week's show is going to be slightly different. So today we're talking about something that's topical and that people are discussing. Next week we've got on the show that this is really linked to diaspora. So let me see if I can get this out. Just give me a second. Paddy, I'll let you go. We can probably
maybe I think David had asked the question that we didn't answer, and I will quickly come to it because I guess you will have this as a live recording. I mean, he talked about if there'll be more surveillance of citizens in China post-COVID. And maybe a very quick answer to that is that I think that like any country, they're really watching the newly imported cases of COVID. So there's a lot of emphasis on that. But anyway, China is on lockdown. You can't go back to China unless you're a diplomat or there are other special provisions. So, or maybe I think a Chinese returning home. But all residents who have been out of China. So for instance, if you've been a student and you are outside China, your student visa was canceled. So it would take some time before people return to China. So I think a surveillance of citizens, surveillance is a bit of it probably could be a word, but I think there is an eye that people do feel they're being watched wherever they go because they're standing out. And I think like Muloongo and I discuss, it's something that needs to change with time. And for all, I mean, there's still some posters in some places that people are still posting, saying, no foreigners are allowed here. And I think these are the things that need to end. But it would have to take, like we talked about with Muloongo, a lot of joint effort in making sure that these kind of notices are taken down, and the level of seriousness would have to be up to it.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And if there's anything we missed, please just comment on the blog. So I'm gonna say goodbye for now.
Thank you, Muloongo, for having me.
Yeah, thanks and I'm sure we'll have you again. Thanks, Paddy.
Thanks. Okay, bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. So a quick one just to say thank you to everybody who's watched the show. Like I said before, this is the very first episode of Diaspora Chronicles, and the idea is that we're going to showcase different Africans living at home and abroad to get your stories about what you think about life in Africa, outside of Africa, some of the learnings. So I just wanted to quickly tell you about next week's show. So next week we're going to feature a Nigerian called Dolapo Oni, and he calls himself the retired Nigerian. So I've been following him on Twitter. He's really funny. I want to hear his story about why he left the richest country in Africa, actually. And Nigeria, if you've been there, is a happening place. So he upped and left and is now living in Canada. So this is an actual diaspora story. And I'm really looking forward to listening to him and watching him. So it'll be the same time next week. The other show that I'm launching on Wednesday is called Bread and Butter. I will advertise that separately so that we're not confusing everybody with the different programs. But a big thank you to all of you for watching the show and for the questions that you've raised. Please keep them coming. And if you haven't had a chance to, please fill in the survey on Pigeonhole so we get a sense of who is actually on on the broadcast and what you think about China's relationship with Africa. So thank you so much and speak to you soon. Bye.